Racism and prejudice is not a mental illness, and I will not let that slide. We see that so many times in the media whenever a white person does a crime against a black and brown person, shoots up a school, or shoots up a black church or synagogue, we hear they suffer from mental illness. No. Racism and prejudice is not mental illness. If prejudice were mental illness, nearly all white Americans who participated in slavery, segregation, or upheld Jim Crow laws would have to be classified as mentally ill. This does not align with what and how mental illness is defined and understood. Now let's talk about this. Let's talk about the definition of mental illness because we have got to stop making excuses for deep rooted racism and prejudice. Mental illness refers to diagnosable health conditions involving significant changes in thinking, emotion, or behavior that causes distress or impair functioning. Examples include depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. These are typical diagnoses for biological, genetic, or environmental factors. Prejudice and racism, on the other hand, is a learned attitude or belief, often rooted in cultural, societal, and historical context. Prejudice is a social phenomenon, it's not a medical condition. It arises from cultural indoctrination, socialization, and systemic power dynamics. It reflects beliefs and biases passed down through institutions, families, and communities. There is no clinical diagnosis for prejudice in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health, okay? Which mental health professionals use to identify mental illness. As I repeated before, if racism and prejudice were a mental illness, that means that nearly all white Americans who participated in slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and many other heinous acts would be classified as mentally ill, and that does not align with the definition. There's a danger of you all and everybody trying to say, well, oh, he's mentally ill. Medicalizing prejudice stigmatizes people with actual mental illness by associating them with harmful learned behaviors like racism. Someone who really suffers from legitimate mental illness. And you're going to put them in line with someone who is just downright racist and prejudiced. It maligns their, it almost like nullifies their uncontrollable situation. They cannot control that mental illness. But you bigoted, racist, ignorant people, you can. You can. And you're going to stop using it and gaslighting us and saying that it's mental illness when we know it's just rooted in racism and systemic racism. When you do that, also, it trivializes the systemic nature of racism and how it is perpetuated through policies, practices, and beliefs, not by individual pathology. When we address prejudice, it requires education, not medication. That's how you know also. There's not a pill you can take to be anti-racist, anti-prejudice. You understand what I'm saying? Prejudice. Combating prejudice involves education, exposure to diverse perspectives, and unlearning biased, harmful behaviors. There are no societal or physiological interventions, not medical treatment. Okay, these are societal and physiological interventions. There's no medical treatments, like I said before. You suffer from anxiety, you may be able to take a Zoloft or a sertraline. There's no Zoloft or sertraline for racism because it's not a medical condition. Prejudice is a deeply ingrained social issue. It is not a mental issue. Claiming otherwise oversimplifies the complexity of racism and excuses accountability. And that's one thing we are not going to do anymore in 2025. We're going to hold your feet to the fire. We're going to call a spade a spade. You are a racist and your behavior is racist. You don't have no mental illness. That person, that young person who goes in there and shoots up a school or goes into a black church and shoots up black people, that's not mental illness. That's racism rooted in behaviors learned from his family, his or her surroundings, his or her teachings and ideologies, and it's a deep-rooted evil. There's no pill for it. And we're not going to let you off the case because if mental illness were, if racism were mental illness, all your ancestors who had slaves were mentally ill and should have been in an institution. Don't gaslight us. Prejudice is a deeply ingrained social issue, not a mental issue. By understanding that prejudice is a learned behavior shaped by societal factors, we can better focus on strategies for dismantling systemic inequality rather than mischaracterizing it as a medical condition. In other words, you're not going to keep pissing on us and telling us rain. Racism is racism, and mental illness is mental illness. And that's that.